to kindly escort Batch 8, our retired teaching group, our current non-teaching staff. Mrs. Charlotte Fernandez, Ms. Telis Barreto, Mr. Subhash Ram Naik, Mrs. Macklin Sardinia, Mrs. Cheryl Mendes, Mrs. Valenki Pereira, Mrs. Patricia Moraes, Mr. Zuze Fernandez, Mrs. Vali Desai, Mr. Inacio de Cunha, Mr. Saljudas Mascarenas, Mrs. Milagrina Dias, Mrs. Antonetta Vaz, Ms. Sharda Naik. Mr. Anand and Mr. Sandeep will felicitate our non-teaching staff. Mrs. Charlotte Fernandez, Ms. Telis Grace Miriam Barreto, Mr. Subhash Ram Naik, Mrs. Macklin Sardinia, Mrs. Cheryl Mendes, Mrs. Valenki Pereira, Mrs. Patricia Moraes, Mr. Zuze Fernandez, Mrs. Vali Desai, Mr. Inacio de Cunha, Mr. Sanjudas Tadeo Espet Mascarenas, Mrs. Milagrina Dias, Mrs. Antonetta Vaz, Mrs. Shraddha Ulas Naik. Thank you very much, members. Thank you, our non-teaching staff. Thank you very much.